Right, so this may not be the prettiest recording ever, but hopefully it will make some sense. So let's say that you are clear about what you want to teach, which is self-regulation, this conscious control of thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. And as Megan and Shauna will often remind us, it's this conscious ability to stop, think, and then act. And so we can use the self-regulation rubric and unpack or peel back what we mean by self-regulation, because even simplifying it as stop, think, act has many, many layers. So we're going to argue that there's a component of attention or focus, a component of regulation, a component of being able to interact, a component of recall, and a component of problem solving. And so when your common outcome is to teach self-regulation to all young children, knowing that it's not always going to be pretty, we can turn to things like the Stop, Think, Act book and find strategies or activities that give us a sense of how to teach that big construct we're calling self-regulation. So for example, the red light, purple light game. So this is much like a game where you're going to just teach children red light, green light that many of us know when we were growing up. And the teacher acts as the stoplight. And so the directions are a little bit different depending on the source, but you get the main idea that there's going to be some way, oftentimes some sort of shape or some sort of object that is one color, which is purple, and one that is red. And it helps children learn how to figure out what to do based upon which color or which shape they see. So are they going to tiptoe? Are they going to slither? Are they going to breathe deeply? Are they going to jump in place? Are they going to run? And so this may be something that you need to pre-teach in smaller groups, or to practice even with a child and a peer and an adult, so that there's a much smaller group. But we'll come back to that sort of pre-teaching. But let's just say you're ready to do the activity. Now, before you get into, but my kid is so dysregulated, my child can't do anything on the self-regulation rubric. Let's just start with, do we understand that self-regulation has the 5 components? And do we understand that the red light, purple light game is a strong evidence-based strategy that will teach all 5 components of the self-regulation? Kids are in the green, they're ready to learn, and I have a match between a common outcome and an evidence-based strategy designed to teach all those components of self-regulation. So we just follow the activity as it is, making different variations to expand it or to make it more interesting for children. But now let's just say that there are children who maybe struggle with the activity as it comes out of the box, as you will. So this is the activity that you got from the authors or from the book or from Teachers Pay Teachers or from Pinterest. And you're like, but my children aren't ready for that, or they're still learning how to differentiate between colors, or I've got children with visual impairments, or we sort of get amped up when we play this game. So before you go outside of this beautiful green zone, know that the green isn't always golden. So you may have children who struggle because of their age, because of their disability, because of some other reason, just something as basic, let's say, as being able to differentiate colors. So when your kids are struggling, but you don't want to change the what, that means you're going to stay at the common outcome of teaching all 5 components simultaneously of self-regulation. Then you have a couple of choices of what you can do to support children who are struggling to stay in the green zone, or even they're not even struggling to stay in the green zone, they're just struggling with the activity. So the first strategy to scaffold and support the activity is to use the zigzag process. So the zigzag is where you're going to keep the same common outcome. All children are learning all 5 components, and you're going to keep the same activity, the red light, purple light game, but you're going to do some things that will either make it a little bit simpler, a little bit more familiar, a little bit more preferred. So for example, if you're going to do the zigzag, you might even do something where the visual support, the red, the circle with red and the circle with purple, has the actual picture of the action on it. So this will help it make it more concrete, because it's abstract to think I hop when it's purple, but I tiptoe when it's red. That's hard for maybe the child to understand that symbolic representation. So on the actual red or purple, you have a picture of a child hopping or tiptoeing. You may even give the child their own circles, a red one and a purple one, so that it's very close to them and they can hold it up. You also can think about, how can I make this simpler or a little bit more preferred, and that could even be to shorten the length of the activity. So it's fun for a while, but after so many revolutions, you're losing half the class. And so instead of going on for another few times, you can stop the whole group activity, and if other kids want to continue, they can take the cards and play with them in the way that they want to. So you're going to just try to zigzag and make things either not so many choices. So one of the variations is to introduce even more than 2 options, or maybe it's to mix up colors and shape and actions. So to make it single, there's just one choice between the red and the purple. And maybe it's to make it simpler and more concrete, it's a picture of the child doing the thing, or there aren't even the red and the purple circles, you just model it. So that's just going all the way through the zigzag and saying, is there anything that we can move from the right hand side to the left hand side that would scaffold and support the activity? Keeping in mind that you're going to keep the same outcome of teaching all 5 components. You just want to support a child who's younger or for whatever reason is struggling a little bit with the activity. Another thing that you can do is turn to universal design for learning. So these will sound somewhat similar because they have overlap with the zigzag. But for example, in terms of multiple means of representation, that same thing, instead of using the red and the purple circles, you could use the actual picture of a child hopping or tiptoeing, and that would be a different way to represent the information. Again, if you modeled it, you could also be able to show the child, if they had their own sort of communication device, or if it was in Braille, or if it was the actual tactile thing where people could feel shoes are for hopping and socks are for tiptoeing, that tactile may be all they need, as well as the support, so it's not always visual. So that's a way to use universal design for learning. You can also use multiple means of engagement. So if you find that children are kind of fading out and not very excited about it, giving them a choice. They can pick what the purple stands for, what the red stands for. You can give them a choice in terms of when you do the activity, the size of the group. You can even give them a choice of who gets to be the leader. It's not always that the teacher has to be the one that holds up the card and kids could follow. So just by being able to be the one that's the leader. You could also have children do this in a smaller group or in pairs, so that each gets to be the lead more often. So if you have 24 children, there can only be one leader at a time, and waiting your turn to be the leader might be really hard for some kids. So breaking the whole group into chunks of 6 or 8 or even 3, then your turn comes more often as being able to lead or pick what you get to tell the other kids to do. So first you get to try to do something with the zigzag, which is helping kids through these 7 progressions that can scaffold the activity. You can also do the universal design for learning. And then the next one is that you want to reduce the stressors. So we want to think about, to get out of the green, we want to think about how can we put the brakes on. And so you may again need to do some practice when the child's in the green, maybe even before this activity that you know is going to amp them up or push them, outside of their comfort zone. Practice what to do, how to notice when you're feeling amped up, or when you're feeling hypo-aroused, when you feel overwhelmed or confused in some way. So you can use these strategies to do things like going silent. So instead of whoever's the leader saying to children, hop or tiptoe, you just put the visual up and leave it at that. Also be careful here with the directions and corrections. This activity by design is directions and corrections. It's basically a Simon Says. It's basically stop and go. And so there might be times where you need to mix it up and ask a question. What are you supposed to do versus telling kids hop? You also want to make sure that this doesn't become something that's about compliance. Some children, when they're approaching the red or the blue, might stop doing their turn. And so instead of having a one-on-one or an associate teacher remind the child what they're supposed to be doing, so giving them another direction or correction, just letting that one go. So sometimes we find that when a child is starting to leave the green zone, we give them more reminders of what they're supposed to be doing in an effort to keep them on track or doing the activity. When the child may need to disengage a little bit and watch and then come back in. You can also give them an actual break from the activity. So if it's going to persist because the majority wants to, this is why we talk about whole group or circle time, so forth and so on, being a choice. Some children might need to leave and come back. You might be able to just sit and watch, and that's an act of compassion. Again, we talked about reducing the group size, maybe even just slowing it down. Maybe the showing of the red needs a longer pause before showing of the purple so that everyone can process what they saw. And again, these are all very similar from a zigzag perspective to a universal design, reducing stressors. But all of this is designed to say, I have the same common outcome. I want children to learn how to consciously control their thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. And we're going to work on all 5 components of self-regulation: attention, regulation, interaction, recall, and problem solving. You're going to just be moving back and forth through all of them as you aim to try to help a child stay in the green zone. So that's long, but it's really important that before we start doing something really different in terms of what we're teaching, or once we look at some data and we go, whoo, you're nowhere near on track for what I'm expecting of all children, and this game is too high. So when we think about the red light, purple light activity, you might look at it and say, there's just no way my kids can do that. If that's the case, you may already be needing to tier your outcomes before you even think about how to scaffold and support these children in this activity. So if you want to simplify or support children in this activity because you're still teaching the 5 components of self-regulation, that's when you use the zigzag, the UDL, and the reducing of stressors to help everybody access, participate, and make progress within this activity. So now let's look at a real child and some real data and say, okay, here's a 5-year-old, and not to confuse colors, but the red and the yellow and the green are meant to signify they can do it is green, yellow is it's emerging, and red is not yet. You could sort of say these are about zones of arousal, but they're not. So try to kind of separate out our green zone, red zone, blue zone while we're playing purple light, red light, and just say, what can the child do? That's their baseline. What are they starting to do, and what are they struggling with? So as we look across the 5 components, we can say, okay, for a 5-year-old, this child's doing quite well with problem solving. I'm going to guess that when they're in the red or blue, this would, of course, look worse, but we all look worse. This is saying when the child's in the green zone, they do have age-appropriate problem-solving skills. The same goes for recall. When they're in the green zone, they're able to do these basic ways of recall. They've got some good emerging skills, and some things they're not mastering yet. And that's just fine. Even though the 5-year-old is in this 5th column, developmentally, it's very typical to be over to the left a little bit and to not always be perfect. Then as we move into interaction, we see a different pattern, if you will, emerging. The child's strengths are really coming much earlier. There's a bit of emerging, not super strong with interaction. Then as we look at regulation, we see even a more concerning pattern. There's a little bit of a strength here in terms of expressing emotion, but that also just tells me this is a child who's probably got some good emotional literacy. Again, we know they've got good recall and good problem solving, so somebody's probably done a lot of instruction around emotional literacy. But what's difficult is being able to actually regulate themselves. And this attention is pretty lacking in terms of we don't have any emerging skills up here on the top end. We barely have some emerging down here in very early development. But we're going to stay focused here on the row about regulation for a minute. So if a child has data that looks like this, our next step, instead of saying, okay, we can't ever do red light, purple light with this child, we can still do that activity because we want the child to be included and exposed to all parts of self-regulation, but our instruction is going to hone in on regulation. So we're going to actually change our what. So instead of all 5 parts of self-regulation, we're going to teach regulation, and we're going to dig in here and figure out what should it be that I can help this child learn how to do. And so when we see that a child is struggling beyond what we can do from a zigzag perspective, a UDL perspective, or reducing stressors, and we're actually seeing that this child needs a different what, but they're still in the green zone, they just need a different outcome that we focus in on. So this is a child who needs to have us teaching them something different while they're in the green zone. We can't work on all 5 parts because we've got such disparity between the 5 legs of this table, if you will. But we want to focus a different what, a different outcome, but still when they're in the green zone. So this is when I kind of alluded to the child that might be watching and not doing what the red or the purple card is saying to do. Instead of focusing on compliance, see this as an opportunity to be attuned with the child. Notice that they are getting ready to be hyper aroused or hypo aroused, and then help them learn to regulate. And so when we think about this continuum of regulation, and I'm going to borrow from the CERTS model, this social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional supports. And in there, we really look at, can the child respond to the assistance by a partner to be regulated? Will they actually allow a partner to help them be regulated? Can they request a partner's assistance to help them regulate? And then can they recover with support from a partner to then regulate? So we may have to start far back, foundational in terms of responding, requesting, and recovering, but the responding to assistance from the partner to regulate. Remember, you're externally regulated before you're internally regulated. Request a partner's assistance to regulate, and then recover with support from the partner to come put the brakes on and stay in the green zone. So once we know that we are working on a different outcome, we can keep the activity just as it is, but we start to create embedded learning opportunities that are giving the child an opportunity to respond to our assistance, request our assistance, or recover with our assistance in that actual activity. And that partner could be a peer and or an adult. Then let's say the child's lid has flipped, and so now they are in the blue or the red. In this case, we're now going to change our job entirely. Our job is now to become the boat captain. We no longer care at all about the 5 components of self-regulation. We also don't care as much about the child's individual ability to respond to assistance, request assistance, and recover with assistance. Which one do you offer? Totally depends on the child, your relationship with the child, what they're doing in the moment. So you want to keep them safe, you want to validate their emotions, you want to help them process through the big emotions, and you want them to be able to come back and become regulated. Does that mean you go silent? Does that mean that you reduce even more stressors, reduce the clutter? There's all kinds of things that we can do when we are offering a lifeline, but basically we are just there to help the child process through that big emotion, and then we can decide what the reentry is. Is the reentry back to the activity? Is the reentry just a place where we can replenish our system? Is the reentry into a small group? So we have to remember that when there's a stimulus-rich activity, it could become very stressful on the body, and the body can become hyper or hypo-aroused. And so if I flip my lid and I go into the blue or the red zone, I'm going to need someone to offer a lifeline back just into the green zone. From there, I may need an activity that replenishes my energy. I need to feel safe, both physically and emotionally. I need to make sure my needs of satisfaction and connection are being met. Then we can worry about, what am I teaching? Are we going to return to teaching how to regulate with assistance? Are we going to target all 5 of the outcomes? So we can return back to what we're teaching once we're sure that we're done being the boat captain, once we're sure that we've helped replenish that child's system, that we have taken note of anything that might be pushing them into the red or the blue so that we can avoid it and reduce it later. And have we addressed their needs of safety, satisfaction, and connection? So hopefully this makes sense, that we start off with, what are you teaching all children? What's your common outcome? Self-regulation. Okay, if I'm going to teach self-regulation to all children, how am I going to do that? Well, one way I can do that is by teaching using the activity of red light, purple light. And we know that all young children struggle with self-regulation, and that conscious control is big time stuff. And so how do we use the Zigzag, universal design for learning, and or how do we reduce stressors during this actual activity to scaffold and support to help children learn all components? Then when we find that a child is struggling of self-regulation, just like any child would, let's take a look here. We're like, whoo, this is not good. We need to beef up these foundational prerequisite skills. We can identify a different what, which for this example was to respond to assistance, request a partner's assistant, and recover with support from a partner in terms of regulating their own state. They just need lots and lots of practice of how to even just regulate their own state. And that's can be their IEP outcome. It doesn't have to be, it can just be an individualized outcome. But in that same activity of red light, purple light, we're no longer trying to teach all parts of regulation, and not even regulation as it would be for all 5-year-olds. We're teaching regulation in terms of its foundational prerequisite skills. Then if a child flips their lid and moves into the red or the blue zone, we change our job entirely, and we're no longer worried about what is the outcome. We are now the boat captain, and we're going to help the child's needs of safety, satisfaction, and connection be met. We're going to help them process the big emotion, and we're going to help bring them back into the green zone. And then from there, we can decide how we proceed.